before about the Battle of Midway. Can anyone tell me exactly what that was? A little review? No one remembers Midway?
It was between Hawaii and, like, we met halfway through the ocean.
That's right. It is an island they call Midway because it sits between the Hawaiian Islands and Japan. Up to this point in the war, almost all the fighting we did against the Japanese, we were losing or kind of making a stalemate. We never had a big victory against Japan until Midway. What happened is they decided they were going to send their aircraft carriers to bomb Midway Island and invade, and they even had plans to invade up into the Aleutian Islands leading into Alaska. They were hoping to draw our Navy out and destroy us. They didn't realize that we had broken their transmission codes every time they got on the radio and talked. So we knew what was going on before they realized it. We sent out our own aircraft carriers and we got into a massive air battle with the Japanese. The result was we sunk 4 of their Japanese aircraft carriers and we only lost 1. This was a major victory for the United States, and this is what a lot of historians will refer to as the turning point in the Pacific War, because from this point on we start going on a winning streak, winning all these battles. I talked a little bit about the Aleutian Islands, and this is something a lot of people don't think about with the Pacific Theater. The Japanese actually invaded 2 islands, the islands of Attu and Kiska. Now these are part of Alaskan territory. The original idea, and it's debated some, was that the Japanese would invade these islands and work their way up the Aleutian Island chains into Alaska. And then if they took Alaska, they could invade Canada and even the western coast of the United States. So we were really concerned with that. The problem is with this area, the climate there is very cold and very rugged, a lot of rocks. And again, this goes kind of against the idea of the Pacific being tropical, because you have freezing cold temperatures on these islands. Tell you a couple quick little bits about this. When the Japanese invaded Attu, it took us about a year to gain up forces to invade the islands and repel them. Once we did, we actually had a joint force of U.S. Army and Canadians invade Attu and fight off the Japanese. Once we finally beat that, we prepared to invade Kiska. The way we planned to do this is we laid a naval bombardment on the island for 3 weeks straight before we sent troops onto the island. Once our troops got on the island, they found the Japanese pretty much had abandoned the island and left. So there really wasn't much fighting that happened on Kiska. We talked a little bit in the past about the Solomon Islands and Guadalcanal. This was the next major land battle, and you can almost argue the first major land battle in the Pacific Theater. The plan with this is our ally was Australia down here, and the Japanese, with their expanding territory, they were threatening to invade Australia. So we sent our troops to the Guadalcanal Island. When the Marines hit the beaches on Guadalcanal, they didn't know what to expect. The landing craft went in, lowered the ramps, and the Marines went running out, and they found pretty much no resistance right away. The Japanese, what they had done is they pulled back into the jungles, into the islands. Our Marines set up bases and set up on the islands, on the beaches, and they even pushed forward to capture a Japanese airfield. They later renamed it Henderson Airfield. Well, what happened is the Japanese Navy actually came out and surprised the American Navy, and they've gotten a little fight. I don't want to say that the U.S. Navy lost the battle, but the U.S. Navy kind of had to retreat a little bit. And it cut off the Marines on Guadalcanal Island, and they were stuck there isolated, pretty much surrounded by the Japanese on the ocean and in the island. And the Marines fought very heavily on Guadalcanal until the Navy was able to push back through the Japanese Navy and send in reinforcements. When the reinforcements came, more Marines and U.S. Army divisions started landing on Guadalcanal. The fighting on Guadalcanal lasted for pretty much from August of 1942 to February of 43. And it was some of the worst campaigns of the Pacific. Now, after Guadalcanal, we decided we wanted to go into Papua New Guinea and all the islands around New Guinea. Again, this was helping to create a shield to protect the homeland of Australia from Japanese invasion. On New Guinea, the Marines and the Army got bogged down in the tropic weather, humidity, and worst of all, rain, monsoon rain. The troops actually got stuck in the mud. Well, the fighting there got kind of stalemated, and this fighting would last almost the entire duration of the war. One of our big concerns is this little island here was called New Britain, and at the very tip of New Britain, the Japanese had a large garrison of troops, about 110,000 men strong. This was called Rabaul. We didn't have enough men and manpower, material to really fight the Japanese head on at Rabaul. So what we decided to do was start a plan they called Operation Cartwheel. And Cartwheel was, we would start capturing all these little islands all around and basically circle around Rabaul and move on. And what we did is we surrounded the Japanese there and basically starved them out. They couldn't move, they couldn't get reinforcements, they couldn't get supplies, and yet they couldn't even fight us because we weren't really right there. And it was very successful. We kind of avoided the whole fighting at Rabaul. This ended up leading into a big debate they call the Army Plan versus the Navy Plan. Now, the Army Plan was designed by Douglas MacArthur. And how many of you guys remember what Douglas MacArthur did at the beginning of the war? Where he was at? Anyone remember?
It's a little before their time.
Douglas MacArthur was in charge of the defense of the Philippine Islands. And when the Japanese invaded the Philippines, Douglas MacArthur had to basically escape and leave. And when he left, he made a promise to the Philippine Islands and the soldiers who were left fighting there. And he said, "I shall return." He ended up escaping out of the Philippines down to Australia. Well, when his big plan was, he wanted to recapture and retake the Philippine Islands. He wanted to leave out of the Solomon Islands down here, move straight towards the Philippines, recapture the Philippines, and then move from the Philippines up towards the Renuka Islands. And I probably mispronounced that, I'm sorry. And then straight into Japan and fight Japan. That was the Army plan. And they kind of dubbed this the South Pacific Plan. In contrast to MacArthur's plan, Admiral Chester Nimitz of the United States Navy wanted a different plan. He wanted to go through what he called the Central Pacific. He wanted to lead out of the Solomons to the Gilbert Islands over here and start island hopping and setting up air bases where we could secure the next island. Go through the Gilberts and the Marshalls and the Marianas Islands straight towards Japan. Now, both of these two gentlemen, MacArthur and Nimitz, proposed their ideas and their strategies to President Roosevelt, who had ultimate say on what would happen. Roosevelt looked at him and said, "I like them. doing both. Problem is, we didn't have enough material and men yet to execute both plans simultaneously. So what we decided is we're going to go with Nimitz's plan first. So the next thing we did is we invaded the Gilbert Islands in 1943. Now, there were two major islands in the Gilberts that we fought at. The first one, we sent a group of Marines, raiders, kind of think of them like 1944 version of the Special Forces. They called them the Carlson's Raiders. They attacked this little island called Macon. They had a small garrison of Japanese forces there on Macon Island. The Marines went in, fought. There were less than 500 casualties. It's a lot you think of, but in comparison to some of these other battles, it wasn't as much. After Macon, the Marines decided to hit another island called Tarawa. The plan was with Tarawa, the Navy would come in and bombard the island for 4 days straight. Within those 4 days, the Navy fired over 4 million tons of explosives on the island. When you look at the island and you see how much destruction was on the island from all the artillery, the big naval guns, everybody thought that, wow, we've blown the Japanese off the face of the earth. There's no way they could survive that. The Marines loaded up in their amphibious tracks, their landing craft, and started moving in. Unknowns to them, and very surprising, the Japanese were well prepared. They had pillboxes on the beaches, dugouts, bunkers, everything. And the Marines met heavy resistance right away. This entire island, not much bigger than maybe 3 miles wide, was heavily covered. I'll tell you a couple stats about this. Within the fighting, which only lasted about 3 days, there were about 1,696 U.S. Marines, sailors, and soldiers killed on Tarawa Islands. In comparison, we killed about 4,690 Japanese. The Japanese that were on Tarawa too were the Special Naval Landing Service Japanese, which was the equivalent of the Japanese Marines. They were kind of considered the elite, the best that they had.
There's a question.
Can I say something here?
Yes, please.
I might add, though I wasn't there, but on Tarawa, before the Marines, it had to be a low tide when they went in. And also, the Japanese had all kind of traps out in the water that their Higgins boats and their landing craft hit. And most of them had to wade into the shore before they got there, and were also very vulnerable out there in the water. And that's another reason that we lost so many men there, trying to get it out of the water into the beach.
Right.
I was there.
You were there? Well, I tell you real quick with this, there was a photographer with the Marine Corps who filmed the entire operation. He filmed it from when they left the United States, and they got the plans on the boat of where they were going, the mission details, and then filmed the bombardment of the island and the Marines hitting the beaches. They made a motion picture movie out of this film called With the Marines at Tarawa. This was a live documentary film. It wasn't Hollywood scripted or anything. It was so graphic because of the casualties, the deaths, that the Motion Picture Association would not allow the movie to be shown in movie theaters unless they got permission by President Roosevelt. When Roosevelt was asked about it, he went to a friend of his who was a war correspondent who was on Tarawa and asked, "What do you think? Is this too bad?" Or his friend turned around and told him, "Mr. President, it's an injustice if we do not let the American people know what really happened. So President Roosevelt approved it and allowed the film to be shown. I don't have the film with me or anything, but I will tell you guys, if you want to watch it, and I'll let you do this on your own, you can find it on YouTube or you can find it on Amazon Prime. The sad part about this is they will show in the film, and this is graphic, they show the dead Marines' bodies on the beaches. This is the first time the American public got a taste of what the real war was like. It wasn't the propaganda and the stories that we heard. You actually saw combat. After we left the Gilberts, we moved further north and northwest into the Marshall Islands. And the fighting in the Marshalls were very much like the Gilberts. Again, the Navy would come in and bombard the islands, and the Marines would hit the beaches. I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation of these islands, but I'm going to name it 3 major islands that we had heavy fighting on. The first was Kwajalein in the middle here. The next one was Inawak Atoll, and then the last was Majuro. Again, the Japanese had dug in positions, pillboxes on the beaches, traps in the ocean. As Mr. Tracy here said, that the Marines would have to go in on low tide, and the fighting would be so fierce that the Marines would sometimes be resorted to doing things like using flamethrowers to burn out the Japanese of a pillbox. The Japanese would have snipers hiding up in trees, and they would tie themselves to the trees so that if a Marine shot and killed the Japanese, their body wouldn't fall out, so they'd think that they're still up there. Now, all these little islands in the Marshalls were covered with Japanese soldiers all over. And with the whole policy of the island hopping campaigns that we were doing, we were only hitting the bigger islands that we could build air bases towards to get onto the next. All these smaller islands we would kind of leave and isolate like we did at Rabaul, and we would starve the Japanese out. They would be stuck on an island surrounded by the U.S. Navy in the ocean and couldn't fight. They couldn't get supplies, they couldn't get food, couldn't do anything, so they just have to sit there and wait the war out. After the Marshall Islands, we started to move towards the Philippines. MacArthur's plan coming out of New Guinea started moving towards the Philippines, and we went into this major naval battle called the Battle of the Philippine Sea. This was the last major aircraft battle of the war, in which the United States aircraft carriers were fighting against the Japanese aircraft carriers, much like what happened at Midway. Again, like Midway, we had a massive victory, and we pretty much decimated and destroyed the entire Japanese Navy in the Philippine Sea. The Japanese planes were running low on ammunition, running low on fuel, and had no place to go. And our planes would actually start shooting them down left and right. So this became dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, because it was around the Marianas Islands. One of the pilots, when he landed, said that it was like shooting turkeys in a barrel. Well, that led us up to the Marianas Islands campaign. Now, I was telling you guys at the beginning of the war that the Japanese captured American territories when they bombed Pearl Harbor. They captured the Philippine Islands, and one of the islands they captured was Guam. Guam had been a U.S. territory since the Spanish-American War in 1898. We finally were able to take Guam back. Incidentally, the Japanese soldiers who captured Guam were sent to fight the U.S. Marines on Guadalcanal. And our first major battles with the Japanese on Guadalcanal were against the elite Japanese troops that captured Guam. We also started fighting at Tinian and Saipan. Saipan becoming one of the worst battles of the war in the Pacific up at this point. Give you a couple more statistics about this. Well, I'm moving ahead. On Saipan, we used Native American Indian code talkers. This was one of the first wide use. We had used them before. We have even used them all the way back in World War I. But we actually used them extensively in the Battle of Saipan. What they would do is with the Apache, was it? Or Navajo. Navajo. The Navajo language, they would make a code and then they would speak the code in Navajo. And the Japanese, whenever they would intercept our messages, they couldn't even understand it. They knew it was a code, but they didn't even know what language it was in. And that kind of helped secure us. Start to talk about setting up air bases. On Tinian and Saipan, they set up some of the largest air bases there that they could support our heavy bombers, like the B-29 bombers. So from this point on, they were within range of actually bombing Japan. And once we reached bombing range, we just started letting the Japanese have it. On Saipan, and I'm telling you the statistics, we had about 3,426 U.S. Marines and soldiers killed in action on Saipan. 3,400. In comparison, we killed nearly 29,000 Japanese. It was estimated about 30,000 Japanese were on Saipan, and we took less than 1,000 of them as prisoners. The rest we either killed or they would commit suicide. The Japanese too considered Saipan part of Japanese islands, so they had their own colonies and they had their own people living on Saipan. Well, as we got closer to the islands, they started telling the people, don't trust the Americans, they're going to kill you, they're going to rape you, they're going to do all these horrible things. This was to the civilian people. So as our Marines and soldiers would get there, and we would try to go help the civilians, they didn't trust us, they would run away. There was a place on Saipan they called Bonsai Cliff, or they also called Suicide Cliff. What they would do is the citizens, men, women, children, they would go to these cliffs and they would jump off killing themselves instead of letting the Americans help us. And it's because the Japanese told them we were so horrible. Again, I'm telling you some of the fighting pictures on Saipan. Now, Palau, thank you, I'm sorry. Palau Islands was the next step. This was in the South Pacific Theater. This was coming out of New Guinea. Now, there's a lot of controversy about these islands and whether they were even needed to have been invaded or not. We could have bypassed them and gone straight to the Philippines. But MacArthur felt that we needed to take these islands to kind of have a buffer and a shield and make our step one step closer to the Philippine Islands. Now, the fighting in Palau was on Angar and Peleliu. Peleliu in particular was some of the absolute worst fighting in the Pacific. Mr. Tracy here was there on it. You were too?
He was out in the water.
Some of the things that the Marines on Peleliu had to face, this is almost right along the equator of the globe. So the temperatures there were reaching about 115 degrees in the day. So they were getting heat exhausted. This was not a tropical island like you typically saw covered with jungle. It had some jungle on it. But this was a coral reef island. So you had a lot of sharp, jagged coral rocks everywhere. They fought off the beach to capture another airfield that the Japanese were building and push the Japanese inland. They soon ran out of water, fresh drinkable water, and with the heat being so high, it really caused problems. The water wells that they would typically find, usually they found were poisoned by the Japanese, which made things even more difficult. And again, the Japanese had dug in, like on Tarawa and in the Marshall Islands, had pillboxes, had networks of caves and tunnels. So what would happen is the Marines would take out a pillbox, move on behind it, and the Japanese would reoccupy the pillbox right from under their nose, and they wouldn't know. So then they'd have to go back and fight the same pillbox again. It got so bad, again, flamethrowers would have to be used to burn the Japanese out. One of the uses of the flamethrowers wasn't so much for the burning of people or anything like that, and I know that sounds bad, but what it would do is it would burn the entrance of a cave and suck all the oxygen out of the cave. So anyone in the cave way in the back would actually die of asphyxiation where they couldn't breathe. Now, this is where we started to see some of the heavy combat fatigue that the Marines and the Army would start facing. And again, throw some statistics to you guys. On Peleliu Island alone, we lost about 2,336 Marines and sailors and soldiers. In comparison, we killed about 10,695 Japanese. You guys are seeing these numbers are getting bigger and bigger as we're getting closer to Japan. This is horrible. In addition, on Peleliu, there were only 19 Japanese soldiers that were captured and taken as prisoners. The Japanese were completely committed to fight to the very last man. They would not surrender. They thought it was shameful. This led to the Philippine Islands. Finally, in 1945, early 45, we made it. We've been fighting for the last 3 years on all these islands in the Pacific, working our way up towards Japan. And we get to the Philippine Islands. We end up launching our first attack to retake the Philippine Islands on Leyte, the island of Leyte. Next was Matador, and then finally the main island of Luzon. This was also the largest amphibious landing in the Pacific Theater, where we had nearly 1.2 million American Marines, soldiers, and sailors land on the island over a course of several months. When Douglas MacArthur made it to the islands and he first waded ashore, and this is MacArthur here, he got on a radio and broadcast his famous speech to them: "People of the Philippines, I have returned." As the Army and the Marines fought through the Philippine Islands, the Japanese started getting even more desperate. What the Japanese would start to do is they would start killing off any American prisoners that they've had, such as the ones that they had captured in the early 42 when they captured the Philippine Islands. These are the guys that survived the Bataan Death March. They would also kill off some American civilians who were in internment camps. They were just getting extremely worse. A great movie, if any of you guys ever want to watch it and see, and again, like I talked about with the Marines at Tarawa, I'll let you get this on your own, is a movie called The Great Raid. It's about the liberation of a POW prisoner camp on the Philippines called Cabanatuan. Throw one more statistic to you guys to show you how bad this is, and please keep in mind too that the Philippine Islands is a much larger network of islands. The U.S., we suffered about 16,043 people killed retaking the Philippines. In comparison, we killed nearly, and this is an estimate, 430,000 Japanese. 80% of that number is considered to have died by starvation and disease instead of direct combat. But as you can see, these numbers are getting higher and higher. We're losing a lot of guys taking these islands, but we're completely decimating the Japanese. And the fighting's only going to get worse as we get closer. Last picture here I want to show you guys. This is a picture of a Marine on Peleliu. And this is what they call the 1,000-yard stare. This is a very famous photo here, and it shows the fatigue of the Marines fighting, and how horrible this stuff got, and how bad it got. As I've been saying with all these statistics and numbers, it's only going to get worse as we get closer and closer to Japan. This will bring up a huge point in an argument, and it's still highly debated today, especially in colleges. I've been there and I've had this debate. Was the use of the atomic bomb ending the war justified? Looking at these numbers, my opinion, and I'll let you guys make up your own, but in my opinion, it was. It was justified because it saved lives. Not just Americans, but even Japanese. I'm going to end the point here and end my part of the conversation today. Again, I will talk later in about 2 weeks on the end of the war when we talk about Iwo Jima and Okinawa and then the atomic bombs themselves. But for the rest of the class, I wanted to let you guys talk to Mr. Tracy and Mr. Ashby.
Show them your former.
That's what I looked like when I, 1945.
Very handsome.
Will the lights be better on low?
So we need some more.
All right.
Want to pass it around? I made sergeant before I got out. I started into just a little private.
You should have stayed in the you should have went to the Navy.
No.
See you guys real
No
quick.
way.
We'll give a quick swim. We're gonna do a quick introduction of the veterans, and then we're gonna go into the Dick Tracy's from Franklin, Ohio. Dick joined the Marines in 1940. Anybody know how old Dick is? Any guesses? He's not 100, no.
96?
96. 96 years old. He was in H Company, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division, as a mortarman. The mortars, favorite places. John Ashby joined the Navy from Kentucky, and John was assigned to USS Maryland, which is a battleship. The Maryland was at Pearl Harbor. However, the Maryland avoided significant damage and sinking. John served in the 16-inch gun turret. 16-inch shells are massive, 16-inch diameter. 2,200 pounds, these shells. He served in 8 landing campaigns with mostly the Marines. And you'll see that they together have kind of a mixed history here. They were together at some of these places. Tarawa, where the 2nd Marine Division landed, John's ship was providing artillery support. And what they would do, they would launch spotter planes. These spotter planes would call in the guns, adjust the gunfire onto the shores. And John is from Kentucky originally, and he now lives in Germantown. We brought some of the artifacts that belong